Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And I apologize for my personal appearance this morning. My wife would call it tefillin hair, but I am due a haircut this week. So hopefully I will look less bushy next time. Well, it won't be. Maybe Thursday I'll look less bushy. We'll see. And just to remind you that at this point, it looks like Wednesday could happen. So, all right. Here goes. So yesterday, remember, we were talking about these wells and stuff like that. And what significance did it have? And I did have a resource that I called Midrash Rabba, which is one, of course, the resources that Rashi himself uses and quotes quite extensively in his own commentary. And that, thank God, is extant. It has been worked on pretty well as well. And I have an edition of it, and I went to it and found a small little piece that makes reference to it, and I hope you're going to enjoy it. And that's what I'm going to throw up now on the screen. I'm going to see if I can do that. So this is the text. I'm sorry about the quality of it, but it's actually pretty clear, and everything did get printed, so that's helpful. So this is the Midrash Rabbah is organized according to the Parshiot and the order of the Sefer Torah. So you can see Midrash Rabbah Seder Toldot, right? That's the Sedra we're working on, is Toldot. And I happen to love this commentator. That his name is Yosef Zundel, and his major commentary to explain things in the Midrash Rabbah is called Eitz Yosef, and he cites other commentaries that preceded him and incorporates them in his own personal comments. And the part that we're going to look at is here, because so this would be Genesis Kaf Vav would be 26, Yud Chet would be verse 18. So this is where we're doing. So Vayashav Yitzchak, right? Or Vayashov Yitzchak. Isaac returned Vayachapor, and he dug out, right? He bore out. And Eitz Yosef's commentary starts up here, right there. So let's take a look at this. So Vagomer, etc. Kama be'erot chafar avinu Yitzchak be'ver Sheva. So the question that's being asked is, how many wells did Isaac, our father, our patriarch, dig in Beersheba? And of course, we know that he was living in Gerar. So here, the Midrash Rabbah is referring to this as Beersheba. So let's take a look. We'll see if Eitz Yosef starts there, or if he starts a little later. Okay, so he starts a little later in this passage. Rabbi Yehuda Amar, Rabbi Judah said, Arba, Dalet, Arba, 4, Keneged Cain, okay? And in corresponding to the number of wells that he dug, which Rabbi Yehuda claims were 4 wells, Keneged Cain, and corresponding to this, Naasu Banav Arba'a Dgalim Bamidbar. And for this reason, or to correspond to this, his descendants made 4, literally it means flags or banners in the wilderness when they were going, from Egypt to the land of Canaan. And we know how because we've already studied this at one point, you're familiar, I trust, with the fact that the way the camp was set up was that there were 3 tribes at each one of the cardinal points, so that there were 4 camps, and that is what Rabbi Yehuda is doing. And look, right out, what is so striking about this is how they also understand, they wouldn't have put it this way, but they are understanding the Torah from a much more literary point of view. They're seeing the literary value of the Torah, and the Midrash, certainly the Midrash Rabbah, but in general, we find that there's this traditional going back, millennia, to understanding the Torah in this high literary kind of manner. So he's taking those wells, and he's saying those wells correspond to the 4 encampments of that surrounded the tabernacle in the wilderness. Let's take a look at Eitz Yosef. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Arba. She'af hashlosha harishonot, okay, he says that even the first three that are mentioned specifically in the Torah, hayus muchim ligvul be'ersheva, that even though it says he was digging them in Gemar, I believe is what he's referring to, he says they were still close to Be'ersheva. That Beersheba is, if you know the map of Israel, you know that Beersheba is like the capital of the Negev, right? Shahaita, here's a Greek word, metropolin, right? It was the major metropolis, Beersheba. V'chol gvuloteha, and all its boundaries saviv, around, in other words, its suburbs, right? Yikra'u al shem ha'ir, would be referred to as referring back to the city of Beersheba. So it's like when you talk about some of the towns in Long Island as being part of the New York metropolitan area. So Gerar, I'm understanding by this that Gerar is part of the metropolitan area of Beersheba. Going on, Keneged Cain, and in correspondence to which Na'asu vanav arba'a degalim, his descendants created four flags, four banners. Mipnei she'ktivat inyan elu ba'erot. Look at this. Eitz Yosef goes right into the issue that was was concerning us when we started this whole thing. He says the writing down of this subject of these wells, Torah, in the Torah, it appears to be unnecessary. In other words, why is the Torah mentioning this stuff? And he says it on the surface, it doesn't seem to have a really significant part to add to the basic narrative of the Torah, which is exactly the issue we were dealing with. And also because we don't feel the Torah has any insignificant parts to it, the question becomes now, well, what significance can we find for it that it might be suggesting? Lazeh kamar Rabbi Yehuda. And for this reason, Rabbi Yehuda is saying, sheyesh bahem siman veremes, that in these wells there is a sign and an allusion, keneged hadgalim, that goes, which refers to these four banners, these four directions. So we're going to get a little bit, you're going to see that there's other opinions like this. This one, making the connection isn't that easy, but I suspect that if we worked on it a little bit and tried to think about the significance of the fact that this includes the four tribes and that, again, understanding the huge significance of water and the part that water plays in terms of its symbolism. So I'm not going to go a lot further with that right now. I'm going to have to leave that as an open question, but I want to go on with this midrash. So that's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. The Rabbanan Amre, but our sages say, Chamesh, that he actually dug 5 wells, Keneged Chamisha Sifrei Torah. And that would correspond to the 5 books of the Torah. And look at how close we were. So I feel that this kind of information that we've just come across, this source material that we are looking at, is reinforcing the fact that the approach we're taking and the hypothesis that we have regarding the nature of the Torah is right on the money. Because this, in fact, Lauren brought it up in our discussions because of the fact, and Eitz Yosef and the Midrash are going to underline this, is the symbolism of Torah and Mayim. Water, we said that just as water is a necessary part to allow life, physical life, to continue, likewise, Torah is the necessary part of spiritual life. It is necessary. So let's see if there's any Eitz Yosef on this. Let's see. Keneged Chamisha Sifrei Torah, corresponding to the 5 books of the Torah. Uvazeh yesh remez ktsat levaer. And he says, And in this, there really is a little bit of an allusion with the word be'er, a well, right, a spring. Ki haTorah v'hachochma nimshala ve'er, because the Torah and wisdom are nimshala, are metaphors, right, are given the metaphor of a spring or a well, al derech, and he quotes a verse, I think it's from Proverbs. He doesn't say where it comes from here, but it says, Shtei mayim mi borcha, drink the water from your well. And another example, mayim amukim eitzah. So eitzah means advice, right, are deep waters. So assuming that the eitzah here is the advice that is given to us by the Torah. So look at how Eitz Yosef is really clarifying and focusing on the connection between the Be'er and the Torah. Now, they go even more specifically. This is, I hope you find this interesting, right? So he goes on to the books, right? 5 books. Vayikra Shem HaBa'er Asik. So remember, one of the wells that he dug, which they disputed, which the Philistines tried to argue with him over as to who owned it, right, was called Asik. But the word Asik has more than one meaning. And here he says, Keneged Sefer Bereshit, that well symbolizes the book of Genesis. Shebo nitzasek HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because it talks about how the Holy One, blessed be He, got involved, got busy, Uvara et Holam, and created the world. So they're clearly punning, right, on this word asik, and this that has a sin in it, and the word asik with a samach. And even so, they sound very similar. In fact, I don't know of any tradition that necessarily has them sounding differently. Okay, but regardless, they are sometimes interchangeable letters. Next, Vayikra Shma Sitna. So that was the next. This is, of course, 26, verse 21. He called its name Sitna. That was a second well he dug, right? That is mentioned specifically in the Torah. Keneged Sefer Be'ele Shmot. And this corresponded to the book of Exodus. Al Shem she Yemareru et Chayehem Ba'avodah Kasha. Because it says in that early part of Exodus that the Egyptians embittered their lives with hard labor. And so this is an act of enmity, right? How they treated them in such with such animosity. And so this corresponds to Exodus. And next, chapter 26, verse 19, Vayimtzeu sham be'er mayim chayim, right? That was the third well which he dug, and it says they found there a well or spring of living water. Okay. Keneged Sefer Vayikra. That corresponds to the book of Leviticus. Shehu maleh halachot rabot. Why? Because the book of Leviticus is so filled with many halachas, many laws, which are, again, like living water, right? Because halacha is what informs us as to how to conduct our lives. Vayikra ota shiv'ah. We haven't read that verse yet. This is in verse 33, and we'll get to it eventually. And he calls it Shiv'ah, which of course means 7, but there is also that allusion to Beersheba, right? Keneged Sefer, and this corresponds to the book by Daber, referring to that's referring to Bamidbar, Shehu Mashlim Shiv'ah Sifrei Torah. So the reason it's called that is because the book of Numbers allows one to say that there are 7 books in the Torah. Now, some of you may remember how that's done. Eitz Yosef explains it. Okay, it goes into a little bit of detail about that. So you may remember that in the middle of the book of Numbers, you have, I'm trying to think of if it's in Parshat Ba'alotcha, that you have a sentence, Vahi ben Soah Aaron, right? And another verse, two verses, that are separated by upside down nuns. And this is actually written into the Sefer Torah. And the tradition is that everything in Numbers up to that first nun is a book. Those two verses that are incorporated in those two nuns that are sort of seen as brackets are a book in itself. And then you've got the rest of the book of Numbers. So now you have Numbers comprising 3 books, plus the other 4 books of the Torah that are designated as such. And now you have 7 books of the Torah. And in fact, what's lovely is that the Midrash itself questions this and says, V'halo chamishahem. And the Midrash itself says, wait a second, how can you say there's 7 books in the Torah? There are only 5. And here we go. Ela ben kapara aved, okay, it says, and ben kapara, name of a sage, aved, this is what he would say, vaydaber tlata sefarim. When he would speak, he would refer to 3 books. Min Vaida, that's the book of Numbers, right? Sorry, I'm going to retranslate this. Vaidaber here means the book of Midbar. When Ben Kapara would work on the book or discuss the book of Bamidbar, he'd say it was 3 books, or he considered the book of Bamidbar 3 books. How so? Min Vaidaber ad Vahi ben Soah. There we go. So in other words, the part of the book that starts off with Vaidaber until it gets to that first upside down nun, right, which is Vahi ben Soah ha'aron, Sefer bifnei atzmo. He considered that its own separate book. Min Vahi ben Soah u'devatrei, okay, and that verse Vahi ben Soah and what follows it, Sefer bifnei atzmo, he considered that a separate book. Or min sofei de piska, and from the end of that verse, va'ad sofei de safra, to the end of the book itself, Sefer bifnei atzmo, considered that its own book. And we can take what we'll do is I'll finish up this midrash and we can go back and look at Eitz Yosef. So the next well, right, the 5th well, Vayikra Shma Rechovot, he calls it Rechovot, Keneged Mishnei Torah. That is to refer, that corresponds to Mishnei Torah is the book of Deuteronomy. It's actually interesting because Mishnei Torah literally means second Torah, right? And Deuteronomos means second law. So Mishnei Torah is a Hebrew equivalent of the book name we give to the book of Deuteronomy. Al Shem, and how do we understand this? Through what verse? Ki Yarchiv. And in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 12, verse 20, it talks about if God extends the land of Israel for the Jewish people. Ki atah hichiv Hashem lanu farinu ba'aretz, and that is, remember, Isaac himself is the one who says, now the Lord has broadened us, expanded us, and we can be fruitful in the land. I haven't stopped for any questions or comments. Any thoughts about this before we take a look at the Eitz Yosef here? Okay, I'm going to go on a little bit then. Shehu Mashlim Shiva. So remember, this is Bar Kapara talking about the book of Numbers. Shehu Nitchalek L'Shlosh Svarim. It's divided into 3 books. I think we're sort of basically repeating what I think you understand already, but just to make sure you fully comprehend what's going on. Kedei Lahashlim Haminyan Shiva, and that is to make up the number 7. Keneged Chatzva Amudeha Shiv'a. This is from the book of Proverbs, which it talks about wisdom in the book of Proverbs, and wisdom there is understood as a synonym for Torah, and it says that wisdom has carved out her 7 pillars. And so the 7 pillars of wisdom understood as the 7 books of the Torah. Ukedeita beperek kol kitvei. There's a chapter in the Talmud called Kol Kitvei, and it states there, Chatzva amudea shiv'ah. She has hewed out her pillars, 7 pillars, keneged sheva sivrei Torah. And there in Kol Kitvei, it says explicitly that it refers to the 7 books of the Torah. Shiv'ah sifrei Torah, 7 books of the Torah. For afilu hachi, and even in this particular case, habe'erot hayu chamisha, okay, that the wells themselves were 5, were 5. Levad keneged hey sifrei Torah, and that would have corresponded to the 5 books of the Torah, right? Hanivdalim behedya, which are separated out specifically, the 5 books of the Torah. Aval hevdel sefer b'midbar l'shlosha sfarim, but dividing up the book of Numbers into 3 books, eino behefresh mevuar b'chamisha shitim. So it is not clear, right? It's not clearly specified in the 5, I believe, shitin, okay? Sorry, in the 5. Shitin, I think, would, I'm looking to see. So a shita means a position, right? Like an opinion. Shitin, chelek ka'asher bein kol chelek v'chelek. Right. It isn't divided up from one part to the other, mehachamisha, like the 5 books are. Here we go. And this is what makes sense of this. Ela basimaniyot asher b'pasuk, but rather by the indications, those upside down nuns, those indications which are in the verse, Vahi ben Soha Aaron, in the verse when the ark was carried. Milamala ulamata, above and below those 2 verses. Kedeita beperek kol kitvei, as is explained in the chapter Kol Kitvei. So this next sentence, right, is, unfortunately, I don't have the next page. I didn't copy the next page, so that I can't give you the Eitz Yosef on that. But I think you get the general sense now of how they're taking this particular section that we're reading in our Torah and understanding it as a metaphoric reference to significant areas. Now, let me stop the share a moment. And, the question then becomes, so we have the Philistines arguing with Isaac over these wells. And this was something we, when I went out on a limb yesterday, I said, is this talking about somehow challenges to the Torah, challenges to this information, challenges to this wisdom? And in that sense, it's also foreshadowing one of the dynamics, right? Because tragically and ironically in some ways, and in some ways, really and truly, the story of Cain and Abel foreshadows this whole experience of the Jewish people with anti-Semitism, that on the one hand, we have a tradition that emphasizes on many levels kindness and compassion, etc., and justice, and yet at the same time has encountered such extraordinary opposition in the course of Jewish history all the way down to our day, and how this is somehow an essential element of the life in which we live. I want to mention something else. Yesterday, when we came to that portion where God was speaking to Isaac, I said at the time that was the first time God spoke to Isaac in these passages. I was incorrect. Because earlier on, we do see where God actually speaks to Isaac. Earlier on, when it says very early on in Toldot, after the story of Esau and Jacob and the pottage, how there's a famine in the land, and God tells Isaac, do not go down to Egypt. And we actually dealt with that. So this is the second time that God speaks to Isaac, and I wanted to correct that wrong impression that I had said. So I think I'm over for this morning, but I'd love to hear any comments and thoughts that you might have. I'm catching you too early in the day.
Okay. I was just curious. Do you know what period that Eitz Yosef was writing when he lived?
Eitz Yosef, I think he's like 19th century. He's pretty late because he captures a lot of other stuff. There's in the edition, in the Art Scroll edition of Midrash Rabba, and Art Scroll has come out with a magnificent edition of the Midrash Rabba. And they also like Eitz Yosef, interestingly enough, but on the page, they have a page, they have the Hebrew page, and then they have the English page, and the Hebrew page has a whole bunch of other commentaries as well as Eitz Yosef. Eitz Yosef is the major commentator on that page, but they also have other commentaries as well. And Eitz Yosef himself makes reference to Matnot Kahuna and other commentators on Midrash Rabba. So while Midrash Rabba hasn't been studied as much as the Babylonian Talmud, as the Bavli, nevertheless, there still is a lot of material, in terms of interpreting Midrash Rabba. That's really first rate. But I'd put him 19th century, I would say, without checking. So if any of you want to check, you can see. His name was Yosef Zundel. So I think this might be a good time. Going, gone. All right, I'm going to stop the recording.